Frontier City Expats Club is a non-profit social organisation and our speakers are volunteers. The club as such assumes no responsibility or liability for the professional reputation of or the quality of services provided by the speaker today.
The club is a genuine authority, used to be a storied career in medicine, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Andy Barraclough, who's going to talk on COVID, when will it make an end? Dr. Andy Barraclough, great friend of the club.
Greetings and welcome to everyone. Okay, there we go. First slide is up already. Let's get a good position. Okay. Have we got good sound at the back? Everyone can hear? All? Okay. When does it end? The question everyone is asking. Well, I'm going to try and take you through in the next 40 minutes or so the conditions around how it might end and when it might end. There is no science, there is no evidence. So from about 3/4 of the way through the talk, it will be reading the tea leaves. Okay. First part is science-based, and then we go into divination. Next slide, please. I regret I am required to read this in full. The views and opinions expressed are my opinions. They do not reflect those of the organizations I am associated with. Particularly, they do not reflect the opinions of the World Health Organization or the Goan Network. It's my opinion, because I would happily see both of them closed down. The material in this presentation is general background information. It must not be used as personal, individual medical advice. If you have a problem, you must always consult your clinical advisor. You cannot use this material. Next slide, please. Declaration of interest. I do not practice clinical medicine in Thailand. I do not provide individual medical clinical advice. The days of meeting me in the gentlemen's urinals at Jameson's pubs for your problems is over. At over 70, I don't do that anymore. Okay. Financial interest. I have received funding from any organisation that couldn't run away fast enough, particularly in the last year for COVID. That's mainly been the World Health Organization and GOAN, which is the Global Outbreak Alert Response Network, who have paid me to undertake many seminars and training materials this year. So understand that I have that financial connection. Next slide, please. Acknowledgements. This is not my material. The bulk of it is not my material. 1 or 2 slides are. It is published information, and where possible, I have provided the URL links to those published documents. Next slide, please. We just take an overview of the current situation, and this color-coded one shows where COVID is increasing. So the orange and red areas are where it's on the increase. So just the message that COVID has not gone away. Although case numbers and death rates are reducing in Thailand, in large parts of the world, there's still a lot of it about. So we shouldn't get too complacent by what's happening here in Thailand. Next slide, please. Again, vaccination status is going along eventually, progressively in Thailand, but in large parts of the world, there's been very little vaccination. That's just a message to keep in the background, and we'll draw on that as we go through the science part of the talk today. So, large areas where there's virtually no vaccination. Africa is less than 6% vaccinated. That's all the white, yellow areas on the globe. So, as we sit rather complacently in Thailand, my message is to shake it up a little bit and say, recognize that a lot of it is still about, and vaccination is generally going not so well around the world. Next slide, please. If we're going to talk about an endpoint, regrettably, we've got to understand some definitions, and that's a problem. The first definition, pandemic, and that's a problem because WHO has been changing the definition as we go along. Then we have this term that everyone is now using, endemic. COVID's got to become endemic. And really that's a bit complicated, and I'll explain it in more detail, but we're talking about endemic compared to what? And most people are endemic compared to seasonal influenza. Then we have the new normal everyone is talking about. I'm not sure I ever got used to the old normal, so the new normal's a bit of a stretch for me. But really that's about how many cases, how many deaths are we willing to accept? And then what are the threats? What are the challenges around achieving an endpoint? We have this phrase, no one is safe till everyone is safe. Well, what does that actually mean to us here? And I'm going to try and expound on that. And then we have waning immunity, whether it's vaccination immunity that's waning or it's natural immunity. You've had COVID, you've developed some immunity, it doesn't stay with us, it wanes away with time. So I'm going to expound on all of these areas in turn and explain what they mean so that we understand what an endpoint might be. Next slide, please. What do we mean by a pandemic? Pandemic is a disease which encounters more than 2 continents of the world. That was the original definition. It's a widespread disease. Just 1 or 2 countries doesn't count. It must be across at least 2 continents. Unfortunately, COVID is across all the continents. Problem with that is WHO has been fiddling with the definition, and that's caused quite a lot of bad feeling. So they've tried to add to it, as it must be a really serious disease, as well as across 2 continents. WHO claims they have not changed the definition because they never had a definition before. So we're not changing it, we're just bringing out a new definition. Not many people agree with that. Next slide, please. So the key point around pandemic is it's widespread around the world. It's a disease that causes serious harm to people. So if we had a worldwide outbreak of athlete's foot, it would not qualify as a pandemic, because it's not that serious a disease. So it has to be serious and across more than 2 continents. So as we're looking for an endpoint for COVID, let's understand it's not just our country, we're looking for around the world. Next slide, please. Moving the goalposts. Well, many people think WHO have been moving the goalposts, and the details of the new definition are really about gaining funding, about gaining aid support, political and financial support. They think they've jiggered the definition to bring more money in. So we have a definition of a pandemic now which a number of people believe is based more on money than the medical need. Next slide, please. Well, why is that so important? It's very academic. We all know what a pandemic means. It doesn't really matter anything to us. Unfortunately, it matters about the money, and it matters in 2 conflicting ways. As a pandemic, that triggers the flow of large amounts, billions of dollars of aid money, which benefits the global health organizations and all the NGOs, all the people like myself that work in this area. So that's one part of the importance of the definition of the pandemic. The other part is the vaccines. The pricing on the vaccines right now is pandemic pricing. That's the manufacturers have agreed to have a particularly low price during the period of the pandemic. The moment the pandemic is declared over, then the prices go up. So we've got 2 competing bodies. All the aid organizations want pandemic to stay as long as possible, and the manufacturers want it to end as soon as possible so they can up the price. Next slide, please. And the vaccine prices vary across the different vaccines for reasons which are beyond comprehension. The Sinopharm seems to be the most expensive presently at around $40. The Pfizer, which is probably the benchmark vaccine at around $20, it's believed the moment the pandemic is declared over, they will increase the price to at least $50. Because that is still low compared to the price that Pfizer charges for similar vaccines. They charge around about $100, $150 for other vaccines in this range. They'll go to at least $50 the moment the pandemic is over. So the detailed definition of pandemic is important. It affects quite a lot of what happens in the world. The global market for the vaccines was estimated at $40 billion last month. In fact, Pfizer is currently getting $40 billion alone in sales. It's now probably around $65, $70 billion for the world vaccine market. So it's big money involved. There's lots of vested interests around declaring a pandemic and not a pandemic. Next slide, please. So we now have this term endemic. Endemic is the background level of a disease in a country. Here in Thailand, there is endemic malaria. It's there. It's not very much. Very few people die of it, about 20, 30 per year, and it tends to be in the border areas. Thailand appears willing to accept that. That's the endemic level. But it varies greatly between countries. So it's not so much the level of the disease that you want in the country, it's the level of disease you will accept. So here in Thailand there is dengue fever. When was the last time you saw the spray truck going round the roads? So we have a level of dengue fever in Thailand, a level of infection, a level of deaths, which generally society is willing to accept. You're not doing too much about trying to eradicate dengue. There are control programs, there are SWAT teams that goes out, but generally they'll accept that level of dengue. And perhaps the classic example is if we look at road traffic accidents and the rate of deaths in Thailand, it's about 50 per day. In the UK, a similar population to Thailand, about 70 million, it's around 5 per day. So Thailand is willing to accept road traffic accidents endemic level of 50 per day, whereas many other countries would not accept that level. So endemic is around what society will accept rather than a medical definition. Next slide, please. So as we move towards the end game, we have to now understand that zero COVID is no longer a realistic strategy. The advent of the Delta variant has shown us that we can't get to zero COVID. We can't lock it out. There's always going to be some COVID around for the foreseeable future. And there is now a sort of consensus growing that we're going to have to accept an endemic level of COVID. We're going to have to accept some amount of COVID is going to be with us throughout the future. And we're going to have to manage that as an endemic disease risk, in the same way that we accept malaria and dengue as endemic diseases. If there's an outbreak, we'll stamp on it, but most of the time we just carry on as normal. Next slide, please. And you've heard me talk a lot before about herd immunity. It's now pretty much accepted that herd immunity is no longer possible for COVID because of the advent of the Delta variant. It's not going to be achievable. Basically, before we needed a herd immunity level of around 70-80%. Now we're going to need better than 95% because of Delta. None of the vaccines is 100%. Even if I could vaccinate 100% of the population, I can't get 95% herd immunity because none of the vaccines are 100%. So I can no longer achieve herd immunity. So I'm going to have to learn to live and die with COVID. And what we're really talking about is what level are we going to be able to accept. Next slide, please. So if we look at the herd immunity on the original flavor, COVID, the so-called alpha, we needed to achieve less than 80%. So if I could get 80% vaccinated, that would give me herd immunity. didn't matter about the other 20%, I would stop the disease in its tracks. That was on the original flavour. It's different for different countries because they have different variants in the countries and different amounts of the disease. In South Africa, it could have been nipped in the bud very quickly if the vaccination program would have been rolled out quickly. It wasn't, now it isn't. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, on the new improved flavour COVID, which is the Delta variant, I now need to be better than 95% herd immunity. And that's not possible. It's not achievable because none of my vaccines are 100%, and I can't vaccinate 100% of the population. So I can't get to herd immunity anymore. So the harsh reality is we're going to have to learn to live with COVID. Next slide, please. So we're looking at an endpoint. And the point around this, what level we live at, is not a medical decision. It's a society, a social decision, at what level we can accept. And it's going to be a constant threat, always in the background. So we're going to move from a pandemic, a worldwide disease pattern, to an endemic, particular areas, particular countries, and hopefully to an endemic level, a background level where it's always present. Next slide, please. Well, what does this mean? Really, it's how many deaths are you going to accept? What's your acceptance level for COVID? And there's no agreed policy anywhere, but there's a sort of consensus coming along that about the same as seasonal influenza would somehow be acceptable. People die every year from seasonal influenza. Nobody seems too worried about it. They seem to accept that, and that level for COVID would similarly be a quote acceptable. Again, there's no declared policy. That's just a sort of consensus within the community that people are discussing and talking about. Next slide, please. Is it being discussed? This is a newspaper article. I don't know if it's true. What I am sure of, is it being discussed? Yes, it certainly is. So if we take the UK, they are talking about possibly accepting 50,000 deaths per year from COVID. And the UK has a committee called NICE, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which decides how much the health service is going to spend, and they appear to be coming round to the idea of up to £30,000, around $45,000 per case of COVID is the maximum they're going to spend. So they aren't going to put a lot more ICU beds in, they aren't going to buy a lot more ventilators, they aren't going to spend a lot on other features. They're going to accept that. I don't know if that's true. I do know the discussions are taking place. That kind of level of acceptance. Next slide, please. Well, if we look at influenza versus COVID, and these figures are for the USA, in around July, the USA was actually at about the same level as seasonal influenza for COVID deaths. So they'd pretty much got there. Moving along towards herd immunity, the death rate was about that, and it was a similar situation in Europe as well. We were looking at COVID being similar to influenza death rates. Unfortunately, the Delta variant then hit and knocked it all sideways. But we were getting close to that level, and we might get close to it again very soon. The debate is around what level are you going to accept? Next slide, please. So if we look at influenza in the European Union, they have round about 3 deaths per million of population. Well, that's okay, we could accept that, couldn't we? But as I look around the room here, there aren't many of you in the first flush of youth. In fact, what I see is a lot of old senior citizens. The death rate among the over 65s is 35 per million. What that means is, when we talk about accepting endemic levels of COVID, it's you that's going to be doing the dying. Okay. So let's talk about numbers, let's understand the reality of the situation and how it affects you. Because you're in the age group that really is involved in this, for influenza and for COVID. So around 70% of the deaths will be among the over 65s. Next slide, please. Okay. The threats are real. No country can end the endemic unless the world. And that's because the virus circulates, and as it circulates, it mutates, and we get different variants. The more virus in circulation, the greater the risk of variants arising, just like Delta to knock us sideways again. So if we don't get the world vaccinated, if we don't reduce the amount of virus going around, we're always going to have new variants knocking us sideways on the disease. So it's in our interest to address that. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of global cooperation going on. There's not a lot of vaccine sharing going on, either from the manufacturers or from the high-income countries that have got it. That doesn't mean that even if we got the world vaccinated, there couldn't be variants. There couldn't still be variants. It still circulates among the vaccinated community. What we're talking about is the probability and the degree of risk. More virus, more risk of variants arising. There is no absolutes in COVID. Just by being vaccinated does not stop it. All we do is reduce the risk. Reduces it massively, but it doesn't stop it, it reduces it. Next slide, please. So if you look at the situation around the world, the high-income countries have given more third-dose booster shots than the total number of vaccination shots in the 92 low-income countries. More booster shots than the whole rest of the poor world has had in total. The rest of the world, the 92 low-income countries, vaccination level is about 6-7%. Pitiful. Because they haven't had the vaccine. That's the degree of inequity that we have in access to vaccination. Next slide, please. So why have we failed to vaccinate the world? What have we got wrong here? There's a scheme called Covax, which was supposed to provide the vaccine to the low-income countries. It's failed. It's only now just starting to deliver serious volumes, and I'll talk more about that in the next slides. The rich countries have not coughed up the money, they've not paid to fund Covax, they've not donated the vaccines. I'm going to skip down to vaccine hesitancy. You'll be aware of. In the low-income countries, people, often quite rightly, don't trust the government. So they're hesitant to get the vaccine. But there's also vaccine complacency. That is that a lot of the countries think, we know how to do vaccinations, just bring us the vaccine and we'll make it happen. Unfortunately, they have not planned the logistics and all the other activities you need to make vaccinations work. So even when they've got the vaccine, it hasn't happened. And finally, in my opinion, WHO has failed to provide the leadership and stress the need for low-income countries to manage the logistics and the practicalities of vaccination. Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair has waded in on the issue, and he said we should provide the vaccines for free, we should provide the logistics, that's all the trucks and the fuel to distribute it in these countries, we should provide and pay for all the medical staff to administer the vaccines, and we should inform and encourage all the populations in the countries. It's great. I wonder what the countries are going to do for themselves. And I wonder how many countries would accept that level of intervention. Next slide, please. So what is this Covax that we were talking about? Well, it's believed, it's not certain, that President Macron called it a coalition of the dysfunctional. And that's a little bit cruel, but only a little bit. Cavid, which is the Gates Foundation Access for Vaccine Initiative, has done fantastic work on vaccines around the world, many different vaccines. Right now they're rolling out the new malaria vaccine in Africa. They've done really well. The other organizations, not so well. So Covax was created to do three main things. One was to encourage manufacturers to scale up to make a lot of vaccine. And in that they've largely failed. It's been commercial outlets that encourage the manufacturers to scale up. Self-financing countries that had money, like Thailand, who could afford to buy vaccine, they offered a service to allow them to buy the vaccine. Particularly important for low population countries. Like Singapore, they couldn't have competed on the world market to get vaccine without this mechanism. And finally, for 92 low-income countries, they would provide vaccines free of charge. So those are the three main points behind the Covax mechanism. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, Covax has pretty much failed to do any of that. It's provided less than 5% of the vaccine in use in the world. Its target was 2 billion. It looks like it might just scrape 800 million at the end of this year, if they're really lucky. It's not happened. It's not been achieved. Next slide, please. Covax just has not been able to deliver. Part of it was they went with the Serum Institute in India, which is the largest vaccine manufacturer in the world. Unfortunately, the Indian government locked down India and stopped all exports of vaccines. So they weren't able to get any vaccines out of India. They went for the cheapest vaccine, of course, which was the AstraZeneca made by the Serum Institute in India, because that costs around $3, whereas the Pfizer was around $20. So you get 7 times more AstraZeneca for your money than you do Pfizer. But the AstraZeneca got locked down in India. They couldn't access it. It never got the money. The rich countries never paid up. They were trying to get money. Didn't happen. Next slide, please. So pretty much Covax is a day late and $1 short, except right now at the end of this year, they are around $16 billion short of their target. They haven't raised the money. And the rich countries said, okay, we can't give you the money, we'll give you our excess vaccine. And unfortunately, they've pretty much failed to do that as well. So Covax was a great idea. Let's have this coalition of all the UN agencies and WHO who are going to make vaccines available to all the low-income countries in the world, and it didn't happen. It's just starting to happen now. 18 months in, the flow of vaccine is occurring now. I talked about vaccine complacency. In many of these low-income countries, and I talk to them nearly every day on webinars, the message is, we know how to do vaccinations. We've been doing it for 30 years. Just bring us the vaccine, we'll make it happen. Unfortunately, the vaccination programs they've been operating, we call EPI, the Extended Program of Immunization, is generally for newborns and infants. So when you're born, you get a whole series of vaccinations. And the countries have been really quite good, better than 95% in many countries at organising that. But the newborn population in low-income countries is about 3.5% of the population. And babies tend to come pretty much every day throughout the year. Okay, you get a few peaks 9 months after a major holiday, but you got babies coming every day. It's a nice gentle flow out of the program. For Covax, I need at least 30% of the population tomorrow, please. 10 times more than they're currently doing. That's the huge problem that we have with countries convincing them that they need to get ready. Next slide, please. And we see the results of this lack of preparation. It's been left to white-haired old professors to try and advocate and promote to these countries to get ready. Where are the refrigerators for storage? Where are the trucks? Who's paying for the diesel for the trucks? Where are you getting the syringes and needles from? What size syringes are you using? The majority of infant vaccinations are intradermal vaccinations. They're just under the skin. Covid is an intramuscular vaccination. You use different needles, different sizes. And for larger people, and there's one or two in this room I can see today, above 100 kilos, you actually need even longer needles to get into the muscle. So it's important, it's a slightly different technique to the ones they're used to. So even if we got the vaccines to these countries tomorrow, the reality is many of them are not ready. They've all got wonderful COVID policies. When we ask them, where are the trucks? Oh, well, they're in the yard, you know. They haven't moved for 10 years, they're not going to move now. Who's got the keys? Who's paying for the fuel? Who's driving it? Where are the nurses to deliver the vaccine? That kind of detailed planning is not there. So there is a point behind former Prime Minister Blair's message that we need to assist countries to get ready. The first point is to assist them to realize the scale of the issue that they need to address. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? The threat of COVID circulating in the world is there for a long time. These vaccination programs are just starting to move along at 6% of the population vaccinated. There's going to be threats of new variants knocking us sideways for a long time to come. So all predictions about the future have got to be tempered with the message of we could get knocked sideways by a new variant at any time. Next slide, please. People think there's only been a few variants. There's been hundreds of variants. Anyone who has trouble sleeping at night can go to the Pango Network site and look in excruciating detail at all the different variants that are there. We only hear about the VOCs, the variants of concern, the ones that really do have a significant and a big impact on us. And those you're all familiar with by now, and the new Omicron as it comes along. Not quite sure how the impact is going to be. But there are lots of variants happening all the time. Well, that's all off in Africa. That's nothing to do with us here in Thailand, is it? We're okay. Our vaccination program's been a bit slow to get started, but it's moving along okay now. We just look around the Southeast Asia region at some of our neighbours. Singapore's doing quite well. Cambodia's doing amazingly well. Myanmar, border with Myanmar, less than 20% vaccinated. What does that mean? We have a threat right on our borders here. Next slide, please. If we look at the ratio of where are the variants, where are they arising in all the countries with low vaccination levels? If we don't get Myanmar vaccinated, we're never going to be safe in Thailand because there's going to be new variants coming in all the time. It's not just off in Africa, we can forget it. We have to think globally, and that's what we mean by no one is safe until everyone is safe. Even if we vaccinated the whole of Thailand, we're not safe because new variants can come in from neighbouring countries who have not achieved those vaccination levels. So it's in our interest to get the neighbours vaccinated as well and get those levels up to reduce the amount of virus in circulation. Next slide, please. Waning immunity. Well, that's another threat to us. It's believed that the immunity, whether it's from vaccination or whether it's from natural immunity, you've had the disease, you've got antibodies to it, wanes after about 100 days. Doesn't mean you're not immune, it means the amount of antibodies has reduced. So, over time, we're going to need top-up vaccinations. That's the sadness, but that's the reality of the situation. If you have a third booster shot with the mRNA vaccine, it really does boost up the levels. Don't really understand why that should be the case. But it moves from the initial antibody level you've got to a massive antibody level. Okay? And that kind of increase means that even if it comes down to half after 100 days, there's still an awful lot of antibodies present. So people are talking about the new Omicron virus. The vaccines are not particularly effective against it, but if you've got these high immune levels, these high antibody levels, you've probably still got a fair level of protection because you've got so many antibodies. Even if not all of them are fully effective, can give you a degree of protection. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've had the science, now we get the tea leaves. Okay. When does it end? Next slide, please. WHO perspective, when does it end? Well, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus was actually in Bangkok attending the Prince Mahidol award ceremonies when it was announced that he would become head of the World Health Organization. And I wonder if he didn't absorb some Thai culture while he was here, because the message from WHO as to when does it end is up to you. Which perhaps summarizes the level of leadership we've seen from WHO this year. There are some important points around that, and we'll come to those now. Next slide, please. So a serious point around this is that if we don't get the world vaccinated, it's never going to end. Because we're going to keep getting sideswiped by all the variants. So there is a point behind his message. Next slide, please. If we look at the best forecast, these are from McKinsey, and the message here is it's not about medicine, it's about social acceptance. What level of endemic disease are you prepared to accept? And it looks like the UK is prepared to accept an endemic level, which was achieved until this week, of about 120 deaths per day. The normal death rate in the UK is around 600 per day from natural causes. They were willing to accept 200, about the same as seasonal influenza. That was what they were looking at. Omicron has rather triggered a higher level now, so we're not sure where it's going. It's about 150 a day and on the way up. But we believe that they will achieve normalcy because they're willing to accept an endemic level of 120 per day. Nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with lockdowns. It's what they will accept as we go into the new normal. The USA is running about 900 deaths per day, probably too high to achieve an endemic acceptance level until March of next year. And again, it's nothing to do with the medicine. This is a social decision of what society will accept as an endemic level. So the prediction is, coming into the new year for the UK, towards normality, little bit of doubt because of the Omicron variation, and for the USA, around March of next year onwards, coming towards some kind of normal acceptance. COVID's not gone away, it's still there, it's just that we're willing to accept that number of deaths, and again, it's you that's going to be doing the dying. Prediction from the USA think tank was that it's impossible to make any predictions. There's just variants arising, you can be sideswiped at any time, we can't say anything. Which is probably true, but not very helpful. Prediction from the vaccine manufacturers, and remember they've got a vested interest in this, because they're going to up the prices. They are saying the middle of 2022 as being the best estimate of when the pandemic will be declared over. I think that's a bit optimistic, but that's what the vaccine manufacturers are predicting. Next slide, please. So what does old Prof. Andy predict? Well, COVID is not going to die, it will just slowly fade away. I think it will be 2024 before we get to normalcy, because we haven't vaccinated the world, and we're only just really starting to gear up on that, and there's a lot to do to get that vaccinated. What I see happening is that people will start to accept an endemic level similar to seasonal influenza, death rates about the same level, and that there will be annual COVID and influenza combined vaccinations. As you get your annual flu shot, it will also contain the COVID shot. You get the two together in one. There is a development now to make a nasal spray of a combined influenza COVID vaccine, so you won't have to get a needle anymore, you'll get a self-administered nasal spray. I believe by 2024 that will become the norm. But that's my opinion from reading the tea leaves. There's no hard evidence from that. Thank you for sitting through a rather technical talk, and I'll try and take any questions.
Okay, good morning, thank you. I have one question. I just recently moved here within the last month, and I have I got the J&J vaccine in the end of June in America, and I was curious about getting a booster shot here in Padilla. Are they available, either AstraZeneca, Pfizer, J&J, and where and when, and are they available and are they free?
Right. I am not aware of any current government program to provide free booster shots. It's been talked about. Everyone says it's going to come along soon, but I'm not aware it's actually there yet. If you're going to have a booster shot, I would suggest try to get one of the mRNA vaccines, but that's an individual decision. You must have your risk profile taken by your clinician. Don't just take it because I said that's it. You must always consult your own clinician. Yeah? There are some mRNA vaccines for sale. You may be able to get a commercial booster shot, maybe, if they have excess stock. The Moderna program at a number of private hospitals was something of a shambles. So a number of hospitals have excess stock of Moderna from people who ordered it and got fed up waiting and went off and got other vaccinations. They maybe have some available, you might be able to. Would I recommend it? Yes, I'd recommend everyone to get a booster shot. Which one depends on your individual health profile. You must consult your clinician for that.
One question. Sorry, you didn't know. I've heard that the Omicron variant is also partially the flu, as well as COVID, and therefore it's beneficial to have the flu vaccine to help you get over any symptoms you might get if you get COVID. Is that true, please?
It's rather more complicated. The simple answer is no. It is possible the flu virus has influenced the mutation. It doesn't mean that there's a flu in with the Omicron virus. Is it beneficial to have the flu vaccine? Yes. If you've got influenza and COVID together, that's a huge load. So having the influenza virus will not stop you getting COVID. It might stop you dying from COVID.
Sir,
Yep.
Thank you for your presentation. Finishing your presentation, you mentioned about the nasal spray, yes.
Yeah.
What about the pills that already are discussed?
Right. The pills that are available are for treatment. The nasal spray is prophylaxis, it's a vaccination. So there are pills available for treatment of COVID. They are very expensive, and they must be given within the first few days of COVID symptoms appearing. They will have an impact, just how much is not yet sure. They do work. So I can see more of those rolling out, but the cost really is prohibitive for most countries. The UK has bought a huge amount of them. They obviously feel the need, but other countries are hesitating because the cost is so high.
Do we know how many people die each day of being vaccinated? I'm aware that the hospitals are not allowed to report any adverse effects, and I know people with adverse effects. I wonder what your opinion. I know that they pay billions and billions of dollars to people who have had problems with the vaccination. The government here in this country.
situation in Thailand, okay, deaths are reported, adverse effects are reported. There is a pharmacovigilance system. I cannot comment on how well it works and how well figures are moved along. I'm not aware of major death rates, and I think social media in Thailand is so active. If there was a significant number of deaths, frankly, we would know about it. I'm not seeing that on the social media sites. So there may well be far more deaths than are being reported, but it can't be that high, otherwise we would know. Similarly, on the adverse effects, there almost certainly is underreporting of the adverse effects. That is in all countries. But again, they can't be that much higher, otherwise social media would be highlighting the case. So I can't defend the situation, but I can't say it can't be so bad either.
Andy, thanks again for coming back and talking with us. I really appreciate it. I know I do. Regarding the new Omicron strain, just from what we can gather now with preliminary information, it seems to be more contagious, but symptoms and overall sickness from that strain seems to be less than Delta. Can we assume, I mean, it's still pretty early, but the Omicron will become the dominant strain around the world? And with that said, more people get it, but less symptoms and less illness, and it may somehow lead to the end of this, or will it just, I know, this is way out there, but just keep on mutating.
There is a theory that Omicron is the virus mutating to a less lethal form so that it can spread more. I think that's a bit of misunderstanding around virus mutations, so I wouldn't put too much credence on that. The Omicron is certainly far more infectious. The R factor is reckoned to be about 3. That means every person that's got it infects at least 2 other people. So the transmission rate is there. Is it likely to become the dominant one? Yes. Are symptoms much less? Not clear yet. Most of the data is from South Africa. There aren't that many old people in South Africa. They're already dead. Yeah? So it's not easy to say in other population groups just how serious it might be. Yeah? It is problematic. There are some reports that it's serious in infants, in young children. Again, too little data to be able to say. Can't say yet. But yes, it will go around the world. The difficulty with this is, even though it's less severe, it's considered to be less severe, there will still be some patients who have severe reactions to it. And the sheer volume of it might overwhelm the health service. So you might get a much higher death rate just because the health services are completely overwhelmed and cannot cope. So how serious it's going to be is still open for debate. It's not clear. Lots of people are saying it's not that serious. We don't know that yet. Can't tell. Okay?
Nice to see you again. It's always an interesting talk, and your knowledge is well appreciated. Just a couple of points I'd like to. They're all are all intertwined, right? Do you not think that they're sort of promoting fear by not being honest with all these reports? I watch the television every morning and I get so fed up with it because they do not put in the vital element, which is people with underlying problems are causing the highest point of death, and that's even in young people. So they're not reporting that at all. And the big pharma have a vested interest not to solve this problem because they want the price. Thank you.
All right. It's certainly true that people with underlying conditions have a greater risk factor. Yes, absolutely. But it's not only them who are dying. And many people don't know they've got underlying conditions. So it's difficult to protect yourself when you don't know your full rate, okay? Has Big Pharma, lots of conspiracy theories around Big Pharma. I don't generally subscribe to them. I don't think Big Pharma is a particularly ethical operation, but I think we fail to appreciate the level of sheer incompetence rather than greed. And I think that would account for a lot of what happens rather than major conspiracy.
I like your opinion that people who have already had 2 AstraZeneca should go for mRNA. What about the reverse of that, if somebody's had 2 Pfizer already?
The third booster shot seems to boost everybody, and any booster shot seems to work. Whether you have a third booster shot, AstraZeneca, that helps as well, but the mRNA really does seem to have a massive response. So the third one really does have an impact. Yeah. Is that the end of the story? Almost certainly not. It's going to be at least annual vaccinations, I predict, for the future.
Over here.
I heard from a reliable source, usually reliable source, yesterday, that the government has made an announcement in which they say that they have reduced the delay time for booster shot after your second vaccination shot from 6 months to 3 months, and that they are providing for free booster shots to all Thais and all foreigners in Thailand at the end of that 3-month period. The gentleman who advised me about this announcement, which makes it sound maybe a little more real, had his last vaccination about 3.5 months ago. So he and some friends of his started looking around for local hospitals, because the announcement also said that people in these categories of foreigners and Thai people could go any place to get that booster shot, and they could not find any place to get a booster shot.
Right. Fine. I'm not aware of any formal government announcement. I know it is the intention, it is the policy of the Thai government to provide booster shots. I'm not aware of any formal announcement yet that that's going to happen. The period of 3 months to 6 months, basically after 100 days, you could consider it. I don't say you must do it after that time, that's just can be considered.
Yeah, I've had 2 AstraZeneca injections already, and I'm scheduled early next year sometime to have a Moderna shot. Is there any problem with mixing these vaccines at all? Or?
It's individual circumstances. Consult your clinician for your particular case. Depends what other health conditions you might have.
They never ask me anything.
Yeah, well, regrettably, practice and theory doesn't always come together, but in theory you should be screened and advised on that. There are certain health conditions which might lead to a greater risk profile, so that should be considered.
Okay, not a question, just a comment for those that, as you know, I keep the club's website and a newsletter, and I try to monitor all the latest information I can find as it relates to booster shots and so forth. When I find those articles, I put links to those articles both in the newsletter. Well, actually, I've kind of changed that a bit. On our website, if you go to the home page, at the very top will be a bar and a button to click that says announcements, latest announcements. It will also show the date, the last date that it has been updated. So anytime I get this new information, it will be put on there with a link to the article, and the dates will show it has been updated as of that date. And the only thing I can recall right off the hand is an article dealing primarily with Bangsu Station in Bangkok, but in it there was a list, a very long list, of what combination of shots you've had as to when you will need a booster. So that's all I can tell you at this point. If you click on that, click on the link to that article, it will give you the various, so it was an AZ, was it Sinopharm, AZ, so anyway, they've listed all of those and said when they think the booster shot should be. And they do promise they will be giving them at Bangsu Station, but as we know, when the original vaccinations, they were doing it there, and that's where I got my first dose. But when they started finally doing it in the provinces, then I got my second dose here in Pattaya, and I'm hoping that as information is developed, once it becomes available in Pattaya, we will be able to post it on our website so people have that information.
Andy, for those of us who experienced unpleasant side effects after their second vaccination, when the time does come for a booster, can we expect to have similar side effects?
If you had a bad route the first time round, I'm afraid the answer is yes. If you had an easy trip the first time round, then you're probably going to get an easy trip with the booster.
I don't want to brag to you all that we've got a new 6-day-old granddaughter here in Thailand. My question is she likely to have any natural immunity for COVID from when her mother was vaccinated during pregnancy?
Simple answer is we don't know.
You mentioned about having effect. I had 2 Pfizers. The first one, no effect at all, but the second one, I was very ill for 3 days. Are you saying I shouldn't have a Pfizer for the third one, or should I have... I'm supposed to have a Moderna, by the way, but I think I've been waiting 5 months for a Moderna, but so what do you advise, please?
It depends on your individual clinical advisor. I cannot give you personal advice. All I would say is consult with your clinician on the best forward way. If you've had such a back reaction to Pfizer, you might want to think about an alternative vaccine, but that is for your clinician to decide. I cannot give personal medical advice.
Yeah, Andy, I know this question was posed to you last March when I was here, and without trying to get too political, in your opinion now, since it's been, 7 or 8 months, do you think this virus was man-made and released accidentally or purposely, or it came through the civets or the bats or whatever the theory is from southern China? You were, in March, you kind of him and hawed at the end and said it had some help.
Okay, I believe it was not engineered. It arose, let's say, naturally, but there was man-made influences along the way. So, if we look at the Wuhan laboratory, okay, they were collecting bat samples. Well, who goes to collect bat samples? It's not the white-haired old professors who go out. It's the young, keen students who had no personal protective equipment and were sent out into bat caves all over the country. Yeah? Now, the first thing that happens when you get hold of a bat is it's not very happy. And it bites and it scratches and it claws and it urinates and defecates all over you. Because bats aren't happy about being handled. Those students then come back to the laboratory covered in muck and bullets, and being students, they find the cheapest place in the world to eat, which is of course the seafood market, which is right next door. How do you get spread of diseases from the environment into the cities? To me, who believes in incompetence rather than conspiracies, I think that's a more likely activity. Can we rule out engineering? No, you can't. It's, I think, unlikely, but it is a possible. Yeah.
Yes, the short answer is this will never end unless we end it. SPARS, S-P-A-R-S, is already planned for 2025. Look it up.
I do and I don't subscribe to conspiracy theories. But
No, this is not about conspiracy theories. That's a disparaging term to dismiss. It's a dismissive term. You can look it up at the planners. Look it up, SPARS. Secondly, the people, a lot of people, this will be over for well before their 40th booster shot. One way to end this promptly is to make the jab makers liable for the injuries and deaths from their product, able to be sued for damages. That's the way to end it like that. A question for you is, why do you keep calling these COVID jabs vaccines? They're not vaccines. They're gene therapy, and they're all in testing. In fact, Pfizer, for example, the clinical trials end in May of 2023.
Right. That's certainly your opinion. I don't subscribe to any of that, I'm afraid. I do not regard the vaccinations as gene therapy. Yeah, I'm aware of the clinical trials. That's perfectly true, yeah. If you declared an end to the pandemic, then the emergency authorization for these vaccine uses would end. Then all the manufacturers would have to register in a normal way and they would be commercially liable. So one way to bring that about is to declare an end to the pandemic. But gene therapy, no, I don't accept that or the other areas. Each to their own, I leave it at that.
Hi, thank you for the interesting talk today. You pointed out that a lot of the poorer countries around the world were the least immunised. And after having done a lot of business in these sorts of areas over the last 50 odd years, I would suggest that unless there is a personal incentive for a lot of the people at the top to actually organise the transport, the trucks and the rest of it, that they will hang out there until there is a personal incentive for it to happen. Without some reason for them to get off their butts and actually do something, I can't see those countries moving forward on that at all. And I think we're used to looking at things in a Western way and saying, oh yes, everything's here, go ahead. They're going to be saying, yeah, everything's here, go ahead. We're going for lunch today? So I think we've got to take a more pragmatic view to actually get a lot of those things to happen. Thanks.
Regrettably, that may well be the case, but it's not one I subscribe to. I do not accept corruption and I will not deal with corrupt activities in any country. That's often locked me out of a number of programs, that's often locked me out of a number of countries. As I once said, I've been banned from better countries than this, but because of my unbending approach to that. But I've gone through that for a long time and I've stayed with that. But I well accept the premise, I'm afraid, yeah. It's the reality on the ground. Okay.
Huge round of applause for Dr. Andy. Come over here, Dr. Andy. He's not 100% health-wise himself, and I'm sure he doesn't want me to talk about that. But we have a frameless, this is a symptom that you've given a lot of talks at the club. We ask you if you want a certificate, and they say, don't give me a frame, my wall is full. I always, when people talk to me about conspiracies, I'm a bit like Dr. Andy. There's something called Hanlon's Law, and it's like never put down to malice what can be ascribed to incompetence. And I found that's generally the case. There's a lot more incompetence out there than there actually is conspiracies. Thanks again, Dr. Andy, and I hope you'll come back and give at least one more talk, right? Good on you. Thanks.